Hello, in this video, we're going to jump into some of Jesus's miracles, specifically starting in Matthew chapter 8. And we're going to look at the story that Jesus's miracles tell about him. Because up to this point in the Gospel of Matthew, we've seen Jesus's birth, we've seen his genealogy, which tells us a lot about him, we've seen the time around his birth. We've seen his introduction into the world in terms of John the Baptist introducing him. We've seen him defend himself against Satan in this temptation fight. We've also seen his early ministry, where he is first introduced to his disciples and calls his disciples. And then we've seen him give this big speech, this big sermon that goes across 3 chapters and really is kind of like Jesus's presenting the law on Mount Hermon. It's very similar to that. In the same way that Moses gave the law of God, the 10 commandments, and the other laws there in Exodus chapter 20, we see here this picture of Jesus in chapters 5, 6, and 7 of Matthew. We see Jesus giving this law. So now we get to see, we've seen what his words say about who Jesus is. We've seen what God at the baptism says about Jesus, what Jesus's behavior in front of the temptation there before Satan says about him. Now let's see what Jesus's behavior in relation to other people says about him and who he is. Because that's really what Matthew's doing. Matthew's getting at, okay, who is this Jesus? And he's painting him as someone who is not just an ordinary prophet, who's greater than a prophet. And even if you look at Moses, who's one of the most important, if not the most important person, compared to even Moses, Jesus is greater. Jesus is not just some guy, some prophet, some teacher. He's not even just some angel. He's the very Son of God. And he's doing things that only God himself can do. He's exercising prerogatives that only God himself can do. You see, in Matthew, you don't necessarily have a passage that just flat out says Jesus is God. But it is throughout that you can see this picture that's really making that point of saying, hey, Jesus is doing, first of all, it says very clearly he's the Son of God. What does that mean? But also, it says that he's doing things, and we're going to see that very much in this passage, that really are God's prerogative. He's exercising power and authority that God reserves for himself. And you're supposed to look at that and say, all right, he's the Son of God. He's different than a prophet. He's greater than the prophets, and he has authority that only God has. This is a very interesting picture. And that's going to culminate at the end when you're baptized into the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, really putting them on the same level. That they're one. So it's very interesting. You're making this slow but subtle move in that direction. So let's look at his actions. Let's see what he does. So first of all, I want you to notice here in chapter 1, in verse 1, chapter 8, verse 1, I want you to see here, it says, when Jesus came down from the mountain. So this is the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus just gave the Sermon on the Mount. So we have to make sure we place all of this within that context. He's just given the law. He's just given this really awesome message that's like giving the law. And now he's coming down off that mountain. And it says, large crowds followed him. And again, this is supposed to be very similar to Moses coming off of the mountain and the people there awaiting him. And a man with leprosy came to him and bowed before him and said, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. So let's talk about leprosy just a little bit. Leprosy is a skin disease or a skin disorder. Now, there is a modern disease that is often called leprosy, but that's not necessarily what we're talking about here. Leprosy here just seems to be, if we look at the Old Testament and kind of look at how leprosy is described, it seems to be just some sort of general category for a skin disorder. It's not necessarily the modern thing that we call leprosy. Any type of real skin disease or disorder could be considered leprosy. Now, we have to understand that this is really important because the people of Israel, going back to the Torah, the first 5 books of what we call the Old Testament, in the Torah, we have a real picture that the people of Israel were supposed to be set apart for God. Just like an unblemished lamb or an unblemished sacrifice, it doesn't have any spot, any blemish. It's totally clean. So the picture is that Israel is supposed to be holy. Holy, if something is holy, that means it is set apart unto God. In order for something to be set apart unto God, to be holy, it needs to be pure. Well, we actually see in the description of how the Israelites are supposed to live their life, because they're part of this covenant people, this chosen people, we actually see that they do all of these things to live differently and to live set apart. They eat differently, they dress differently. There are certain things they're not allowed to do that the pagan peoples around them are allowed to do. And there's all of these ways that they live that sets them apart. They keep Sabbath, meaning they rest 1 day a week, which is something that the other people don't do. And one of those things that they do that's different is they have certain rules surrounding people who have leprosy, a skin disorder. Because the idea here is that if you have these skin disorders, that skin disorder actually represents blemish. It represents impurity. So those who have skin disorders are considered ritually unclean. Now, it's important for us to understand this does not mean that they are considered sinful. Not sinful. There's a difference between ritual purity and sinfulness. Ritual purity refers to a sense in which, am I pure symbolically to a large degree, but am I pure when it comes to the rituals surrounding approaching God? Because the idea is that the people of Israel are God's special people, and in a way that's unlike anything else, God himself dwells among his people, Israel. So yes, Israel has a tabernacle. They have a temple that God dwells in a special way. But that temple, that tabernacle, is in the midst of his people. So there's a sense in which his people have to be ritually pure, ritually clean. They have to be set up in a way that does not disgrace this God who's dwelling in their midst. And leprosy is seen as something that makes you ritually impure. Okay? So when it comes to leprosy, what they would do is they would have a person who's a leper would have to be outside of the camp. By this time, they're not going around in tents. They're not nomadic like they used to be. So the idea is that they would be often out on the outskirts of a city. They wouldn't be right in the midst of the city or in the town in quite the same way. Maybe they come into the synagogue, but when they do that, they're in a special place. There's a set apartness that's there. And there's a sense in which if you're a leper, you don't want to have physical contact with someone who is so-called, we'll say, ritually clean or ritually pure, because that would make them impure ritually. So if a person is ritually impure, they can't do things like go to the temple and make sacrifices, right? Again, it's not sinful, and you might have many people that walk around who are ritually impure, right? Women who have their menstrual cycle are impure, are considered ritually impure for the duration of that menstrual cycle. After women have a baby, they're ritually impure for a certain period of time after that. In the case of just any person, a male or female, if you touch a dead body, you're considered ritually impure. If you come in contact with blood or some other type of fluid like that, you're ritually bodily fluid like that, you're ritually impure. Sexual contact can make a person ritually impure, whether they be male or female. So there are a lot of different things that would make a person ritually impure. And many people might walk around all the time being ritually impure. In the Old Testament, ritual impurity is most important when you're entering the tabernacle or entering the temple, which is where sacrifices are made. It's considered the place where God's presence dwells, right? However, by the time of Jesus, what you start to see is these rules about ritual purity, which primarily were applied to the priests or people who were going into the temple, start to get applied outside of that. The Pharisees in particular, who are very much out in the villages outside of Jerusalem, who have a power base in that area, really emphasize how being around, how we need to be pure all the time, not just when we go into the temple, but generally try to strive for a ritual purity. So this really affects someone who would be a leper, because in a lot of ways they would be ostracized, because the view is that impurity is contracted through contact, right? So if you could be totally ritually pure, and then another person who's ritually impure touches you, and now you're impure as well. If you have something that is pure, let's say you have a cloth or some kind of ritual item or even ritual bread of some kind, if a person who's impure touches it, that impurity crosses onto the pure thing. So the thing that is considered ritually pure is made impure by contact. So think of it kind of like if I were to go out and fall into a huge mud puddle and I get mud all over myself. And if anything I touch will get muddy. It will get dirty. It will become ritually impure. And because God is pure, his dignity, God's dignity, his power, his glory, he deserves for us when we approach him to be pure. When we approach God, we don't approach him ritually impure or in an improper way. We approach him totally clean. So the fact that this view of purity is now not just coming into the temple, but all the time, that so often people are kind of, this view of ritual purity is starting to become a little more of a daily thing, where certain Pharisees, they're washing themselves to be ritually pure. They're doing all these different things, and they're really emphasizing ritual purity outside of temple worship. Someone who is, say, a leper is very much left on the outside. So when you have this leper coming to Jesus, Jesus has just given this huge speech, this huge sermon. And one of those things in the sermon is he says, I haven't come to destroy the law, to obliterate the law, but to fulfill it, to set it right for what it always was meant to be, to fulfill that law. And now you have this leper who, because of the interpretation of the law that people have, is very much put on the outside. He's on the outside looking in. He's not able to have the same kind of physical contact with his community and with the society that he's within. He comes to Jesus and he says, Lord, which just means master. In this particular case, it's not necessarily a religious term. It just means master, Lord. It says, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. What he's saying is, Jesus, I've heard of what you can do. I've just seen your speech. I believe that you have the authority to make me clean. I'm living this life where I'm on the outskirts. I'm on the edges. I'm less than because of this disease. You can make me clean. And the implicit thing here is this cry of, will you make me clean? If you're willing, if you would look at me in mercy, you can do that. And what do we see Jesus do? It says, then Jesus reached out his hand and he touched him. I am willing. Be cleansed. Now, this is something that you really have to grasp when it comes to this idea of touching, because what Jesus just did is a big no-no most of the time. Because if I touch someone who's a leper, even if I'm ritually clean, I just became ritually unclean because I touched an unclean person. But notice what happens right after this. It says, I am willing, be cleansed. So his hand, he reached out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed. And immediately the leper is cleansed. You're supposed to pick up on this. If you have that Israelite mindset, you just notice something here. The pattern reversed. Normally, unclean person touches clean person, the clean person becomes unclean. If I have hands covered in mud and I touch someone with a white t-shirt, they now have mud handprints on their t-shirt. But the picture of what just happened with Jesus is that Jesus, he's so clean. Jesus is so powerful. He's so clean that when unclean comes in contact with him, it becomes clean. Imagine a white t-shirt that was so white that if I touched it with my muddy hands became clean and the white t-shirt stayed just as white as it was. You would say, that's impossible. That's not how things work. If I touch my muddy hands on that white t-shirt, my hands might come a little cleaner, but that t-shirt's now dirty. But you see what happened with Jesus is he stayed just as pure and as clean ritually, and the leper became clean. See, this is something that Israelites would have looked at and been like, hey, that's not how that's supposed to work. This is shocking. And that's the point that Matthew's trying to make here, is Jesus is not like other prophets. He's not like Moses. He's not like any other prophet. He himself is so powerful that when he touches the unclean, it becomes clean, not the other way around. And then notice what he does next. See that you tell no one. So this idea, tell no one. See, Jesus doesn't want them to tell anybody, because if Jesus's power gets out, if it gets out of how powerful Jesus is, people will start saying Jesus is Messiah, and they're going to want to start making Jesus the king. They're going to want to start trying to put Jesus up on a pedestal to make him like he's a king. And that's not what Jesus is looking for right now. He's not looking for earthly kingdom. Now, well, let me adjust this. Okay, so what do we see next? But go, show yourself to the priest and present the offering that Moses commanded, as a testimony to them. So this is just something that we see in the Old Testament. It's mentioned that if you pray and God chooses to cleanse you as a leper and your leprosy goes away, in order to have that it official that you're now clean, ritually clean, you have to go and make sacrifices, make an offering at the temple, and a priest has to confirm that you no longer have leprosy. And that's part of Moses's command. That's part of the law of Moses. So you see Jesus saying, hey, I'm fulfilling the law. I just said that I'm not here to destroy the law. I'm here to fulfill it. And what does he do? He cleanses this leper, and then he says, give God the credit. Don't tell anybody that it was me. Go and make your offering at the temple. Next thing we see here is something interesting, because so we've seen the leper, who is considered really outside of society because he's ritually unclean. Next, we're going to see Jesus have contact with two other people, a centurion. Here, he's going to have contact with the centurion, and then a little bit further down, we'll see him have contact with a woman who has an issue of blood, which also makes her impure. So we're going to continue seeing Jesus do this. So he has this encounter with a centurion. And when Jesus entered Capernaum, or Capernaum, however you want to pronounce it, a centurion came to him and begged him, saying, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home and terribly tormented. So I want you to picture this, because this is a slightly different issue. This is not an individual who, according to the law of Moses, is impure. Gentiles, if he's a centurion, this means, if he's a Roman centurion, that means he's a Gentile. He's non-Jewish. And we need to kind of grasp this. There's this real contrast at this point between the Romans and the Jews, or the Israelites, where the Romans, they're Gentiles. They're an occupying force. They are occupying this territory. And yeah, there are political people that are helping this to happen, Jewish political people that are allowing this to happen, helping this to happen. Also Idumeans and others who are allowing this to happen. But ultimately, there is this sense in which we are being oppressed, we are being occupied. Just like the Babylonians controlled us and the Assyrians controlled us, just like Alexander the Great and the kingdoms that followed him, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies controlled us. We're now being controlled by the Romans. They're Gentiles. They're not like us. They worship false gods. They worship idols. They're not like us. So the picture in the Old Testament, you don't see Gentiles as being ritually impure. That's not something you see in the Old Testament. By the time you get to the New Testament time period, people, Jewish teachers and others, the basic Jewish view here is that Gentiles are basically ritually impure because they worship idols. So essentially, they're ritually impure. Therefore, they cannot enter the temple. In fact, if you read Acts, you get to around Acts 21, you'll actually see Paul's going to get attacked because people think he brought a Gentile into the temple. He didn't, but that's what they thought. So as a result, he's going to get attacked by there's going to be a riot, and the mob is going to attack him, and he's going to be arrested. So there's this view that comes by the time you get to the period of Jesus, there's this view that Gentiles are effectively impure. And really, there's this view that Gentiles, they are other. Now, a Gentile can choose to get circumcised and become Jewish. And if they do that, then sure, they're what they would call a proselyte or proselyte. But unless that happens, you are other. So now we have this very interesting picture where we have Jesus just healed this leper. Now he's going into Capernaum, and now he sees this centurion, this Roman centurion, who is basically a commander of a military unit that roughly goes from 80 to 100 soldiers. 80 to 100, depending on what type what type of century it is. 80 is probably more typical here, but it also could be a detachment that's slightly smaller than that. But he's a centurion. And so this centurion, who is other, he's not an Israelite. He's not the same ethnic group as Jesus. He's not like Jesus or the others. He's not an Israelite. He worships false gods. That's the big, he's not a follower of God. That's the picture you get here. He comes and he says, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home and is greatly tormented. He's pleading to Jesus. The leper, who is the outsider, pleads with Jesus. Please make me whole. Now, the other outsider, a Gentile, pleads with Jesus, please heal my servant. And Jesus said to him, I will come and heal him. So Jesus offers to do something pretty big. You got to grasp this. Jesus offers to walk with the centurion, to go home with the centurion, because that's where the paralyzed person is. They're at home. The centurion's home because he's a servant, right? Really a slave, most likely. So Jesus offers to go with him. That's a huge deal. You got to grasp this. In Acts, when Peter goes to visit the home of Cornelius, another Roman centurion, he's like, I'm not even supposed to walk into your home. I'm not supposed to be here, but the Holy Spirit told me to come. He's hesitant to even walk in this man's house. And we actually do have Jewish documents that talk about ritual impurity, the Mishnah, about how ritual purity can be transmitted to you if you go into an enclosed space. If you go into an enclosed space, and it's ritually impure in there, then that impurity can convey on you, right? So, and that's in the Mishnah. It's written around the 2nd century AD, but it often, most of us would say that it represents a lot of tradition that goes back to the time of Jesus. You don't know for sure, but there's a lot that it contains that represents those earlier traditions. So you have this picture of Jesus is willing to go into this enclosed space with the centurion's home, which, if you take what Peter said, it seems like even Peter was thinking, hey, that could convey impurity. If you look at how Peter reacts in the book of Acts. But notice what the centurion says. It says, but the centurion replied, Lord, I am not worthy for you to come under my roof, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I say to this one, go, and he goes, and the other, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and he does it. Notice what the centurion is saying here. He's saying, Jesus, I believe you're all powerful. I've heard who you are. I've seen what you can do. I'm recognizing that you have power, and that if you have power, you don't need to be there. You just say it and it'll be done. I'm a person in authority. That's how it works. When you have authority, you say, do it, and they do it. You don't have to be there. You don't have to watch it because you said it. Therefore, it will happen. So that's the picture that we have here. Now, I want you to understand just how much faith this takes, because you have this Gentile, you have this person who is not of Israel. He's not a proselyte. He's not someone who's converted, as far as we know. And you feel like that probably would have been said had it been the case. And look how Jesus responds. Now, when Jesus heard this, he was amazed and said to those who were following, truly I say to you, I have not found such faith with anyone in Israel. This is another indicator that he's not a proselyte. He's someone who is not of Israel. And I say to you that many will come from the east and from the west and recline at the table of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the sons of the kingdom will be thrown out into the outer darkness. in their place, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. I want you to get this. I mentioned earlier when we were in chapter, I believe 4, how you start to see the little hints that he's ministering to Gentiles. You see that little hint there because he's in Galilee. You have a high Gentile presence there. Then in Syria, and then in the Decapolis, you have a lot of Gentiles there. And then now here, it's pretty clear, because what is he saying here? He's saying, man, this centurion, y'all don't get it, do you? Look at this centurion. He's not of Israel, yet he's got more faith than all of you. Not a single one of you have as much faith as him, because he saw that I was here, that I was sent by God, and he had so much faith that he said, you just say the word and it'll happen. I have so much trust in you that if you just say it, done. That's the point Jesus is making. Jesus is saying, you who are of Israel, you guys think just because I'm Israelite, because I'm ethnically Israelite, I was born from Israelite parents and have been raised going to synagogue, following the law, following the Jewish law. You think just because I'm ethnically Israelite, I'm good. But he's saying, I'm telling you that there are Gentiles among you that have more faith in God than you. And they don't know the law like you do. They don't have the ethnic pedigree, but they have more faith in God than you. Now, this is something that Jewish readers, Israelite readers of Matthew would be shocked. Like, that's the point here. He's starting to really punch it up to show that actually it's not the people that look like they have it all together that are actually trusting in Christ, that are trusting in God and have faith in God, but it's actually the people who have been on the margins, that have actually not been part of Israel, but have actually had faith or been ready to repent of their sins and put their faith in God. You even see that with John the Baptist, right? When he introduces Jesus, Sadducees and Pharisees come to John and he says, you vipers, what are you doing? You're a bunch of vipers. You need to repent. So now look here. I say to you that many will come from the east and the west and recline at the table of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. All right, so I want you to get this. So the table of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that's this picture of the kingdom. In the kingdom of heaven, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they are the first generations of that chosen people of God. So he's saying people from the east and from the west. So these are people who are not Israelite. He's saying there are people who are going to come who are not Israelite. They're from the east and they're from the west. They're not from here. And they're going to come and they're going to recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The picture here is that people who are not Israelites are going to have the same seat of honor that the patriarchs had. That they're going to be sitting at the table in the kingdom of God right there next to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is huge. This is in your face language that Jesus is using here. This is really shocking. Hey, a Gentile, a lot of Gentiles are going to be sitting at the table in the feast before God in his kingdom. They're going to be sitting at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But notice this, verse 12. But the sons of the kingdom will be thrown out into darkness. What is he saying? And there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. What is he saying? There are going to be people who are Gentiles who ethnically don't come from Israel. They're not descendants of Israel. And they're going to sit there in the kingdom of heaven next to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then there are going to be Israelites, Jews, people who are ethnically of Israel, and they're going to be kicked out. God's going to say, go away, I never knew you. Understand how powerful of a picture that is. At this point, Matthew's really on it. You think that just because you're Israelite, just because you're descendants of Abraham, God somehow owes you. You somehow are grandfathered in with faith. And he's saying, no, because you got Gentiles who have more faith than you. Gentiles who have more trust in God than you. And those Gentiles, they're gonna enter the kingdom. But those who think, well, because I'm Israelite, I'm good. Those who think because because I grew up as part of this group, I'm good. God's not going to have anything to do with them. You don't have real faith. And now, just to be personal, I would say that the application actually applies to us as Christians. There are many people who grew up going to church who are culturally Christian and who would say who would say, oh, I'm a Christian, but they don't really have faith in God. And I think that the application by extension is to that group as well for this passage. So now we see Jesus said to the centurion, go, it shall be done for you as you have believed. And the servant was healed at that very moment. So let's keep going. So we see these two big healings that just happened. Let's keep on going here. So we see he's going to be going in verse 14. Then Jesus came to Peter's home. He saw his mother-in-law, Peter's mother-in-law, laying sick in bed with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her. And she got up and waited on him. Again, notice the importance of touch here. He touches her, and instead of him getting sick, she gets well. Okay? Again, this is something that some prophets can do. We do have examples of prophets healing someone, but it's not super common, right? You have an example of a prophet even healing a leper. Elisha healed Naaman, healed a leper, but he didn't do it by touching him. He did it by telling him to go bathe in the river 7 times. So it's still different. Next we see in verse 16, and now when evening came, they brought to him many who were demon-possessed, and he cast out the spirits with a word, and he healed all who were ill. This happened so that what was spoken through Isaiah the prophet would be fulfilled. He himself took our illness and carried away our disease. Again, you see this continued picture. Jesus, even the demons tremble and are cast out when Jesus comes in. He's doing something that you don't see. This is not something that you see all the time. This is not common. It wasn't common in the Old Testament, and it wasn't common in this time. People are amazed. And we'll see a little later where people are amazed at all of this, because this is not something that happens. Jesus is doing something that is unprecedented. Even the prophets didn't have this kind of power. Elijah, Isaiah, Moses, even them, they did not have this kind of power. Even Elisha did not have this kind of power. So next in verse 18, we see, and now Jesus saw a crowd around him, and he gave orders to depart to the other side of the sea. And when a scribe came and said to him, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." Jesus said to him, "The foxes have holes, and the birds of the sky have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." So a scribe, just to let you know what a scribe is someone who is a learned, educated person. Pharisees had scribes that were part of that group. You also had Sadducees that had scribes. Other groups like the Essenes had scribes that were part of them. Scribes just really refers to someone who is particularly learned. They can write, they can read, they can copy things. Now, I want to be clear there. It does seem that a lot of people, at least in this urban environment, had some level within the synagogue reading ability, at least among men. I'm not sure about how much women were educated. There does seem to be some indication, at least among men in these urban areas, in the synagogues, that someone like Jesus was able to read. We see his disciples being able to write letters, like Peter writing a letter. So there seems to be an indication that there was some level of education there. But scribes in particular are people who really dedicated themselves to understanding the law of Moses, the law of Israel, the traditions of being able to read and write. And that was kind of their thing. So you have this scribe who says, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." And the context here is most likely that he's saying, Jesus, I see you're really going to be successful, and I want to attach myself to you because you have all of this status that you're going to get, and I want to get that status too. So how you see Jesus respond is he says, "Foxes have holes, birds of the sky have nests, Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." He says, look, sure, you can follow me, but understand, this is not cushy. I'm traveling. I'm going. I don't have a home base per se. So you're not, if you want to follow me, you go ahead and follow me, but you're not getting what you want. You're not going to be, we're not riding the gravy train all the way to the palace. That's not what's happening here. Next we see, and another of the disciples said to him, "Lord, allow me to go and bury my father." So disciples just means someone who's a learner. So this is somebody who wants to follow Jesus as a disciple and be a learner. But he says, "Hey, let me go bury my father first." Now I want you to grasp what's happening here. The picture is, hey, I'd love to follow you, but before I can do that, I have to go do this other thing. Now, some have suggested, oh, well, maybe his father wasn't actually dead yet. We don't really know. I would think probably his father's dead, and this probably has a little more to do with inheritance. Of, hey, I want to go bury my father because I don't want to lose out on my inheritance. If I don't go and make sure that whatever inheritance I have is settled, then I might not have anything when I come back. That might be it. We don't know for sure, but Jesus gives him a very blunt answer. He says, "Follow me and let the dead bury the dead." Basically, he's like, at this point, you want to follow me? Follow me. I'm not ready to hear excuses. Follow me or don't. That's kind of the picture here. He's inviting him to follow him, but he says, "Hey, I need you to go all in." This is a little bit interesting because you see a similar thing when Elisha wants to follow Elijah, where Elisha makes a similar comment, and Elijah just says, "I don't care, do what you do." And then Elisha goes and he sacrifices all of his oxen and burns them as a burnt sacrifice. So there's a little bit of similarity there, but a very different response from Jesus here. So next we see them get into the boat. And this is a very interesting story here because it says when he got into the boat, the disciples followed him. So they were doing exactly what Jesus told them to do. And behold, a violent storm developed on the sea, so that the boat was covered by the waves. And Jesus himself was asleep. And they came to him and woke him, saying, "Save us, Lord, we are perishing." And he said to them, "Why are you afraid, you men of little faith?" When he got up and rebuked the wind, then he got up and rebuked the wind and the sea, and it became perfectly calm. And the men were amazed and said, "What kind of man is this that even the wind and the waves obey him?" So in the story, there's a lot of things we could dive into. But what I really want you to grasp is a couple of things here. This idea that he's sleeping. One, we see Jesus is just like anybody else, any other human being. Jesus, yes, we believe Jesus is God. I believe scripture is clear there, but he's also fully man. He gets tired. Jesus got tired. I think that's very clear. What's interesting is a lot of Jesus's followers are fishermen. A lot of them are fishermen. So they know what it means to go fishing and to have storms come up. They're on the Sea of Galilee, sometimes called the Sea of Tiberias, but they know what it's like. These major storms would come over the Sea of Galilee, and they get extremely violent. Remember, the sea is more like a large lake, but it would become extremely violent, and they got to this point where they're like, man, water's pouring in. We're about to die. This is going to be it. And notice what he says when they wake him up. It says, you have little faith. Like, y'all don't believe? And understand the point that he's making. He's saying, you've seen me cure lepers. You've seen me, if you go back, you've seen me cure lepers. You've seen me heal the paralyzed, heal the sick, cast out demons. You've seen me do all of these things. All of it. Some really incredible things you've seen me do. And you don't trust that I can get you out of this? You don't trust that I can protect you here in this situation? He's questioning their faith. Based on what you've seen me do you really think that this is going to be something that I can't handle? And really the point here is, of course they do. They're professional. A lot of them are professional fishermen. This is the kind of thing that kills people. Like, yeah, we're scared. Of course we're scared. Because they're wanting him to grab a pail and help pail water out, or maybe row. These things kill people. It never even occurs to them that he's so powerful that not only can he cast out demons, heal the sick, get rid of leprosy, heal paralytics, it doesn't even occur to them that he can simply speak and even the wind and the waves will calm down. That nature itself is so beholden to him that a mere word makes nature calm down. Like, that's the picture here. And you see it. It says, and then he rebuked the wind and the waves, and it became perfectly calm, and the men were amazed. You look in Mark, it says they were afraid. That's the language that's used there in Mark. And they were amazed, or they were afraid, and said, what kind of man is this, that even the wind and the waves obey him? I want you to grasp this. Who has control over the wind and the waves? God. No one else can control the wind and the waves. No one else can stand up, can do that. Nobody. You see God parting the Red Sea under Moses and under Joshua, but that's very different than a huge storm just being done. Peace be still. That's immensely different. What just happened here is something that only God himself can do. God himself holds the prerogative of controlling the wind and the waves, controlling the weather. Only God. So again, notice what's happening here. He's doing things that the prophets couldn't do. Moses couldn't do. None of the other prophets can do. And then as you see him marching along, it's getting greater and greater and greater. And now even the wind and the waves obey. He's doing something that only God can do. Nobody else can do this but God. And notice how they respond. They're amazed. They're afraid. See, they went from being afraid of the storm that was outside of the boat to being afraid of the storm that was in the boat, the calmer of the storms that was in the boat. That's the idea. You're afraid of something outside, and then you realize the one inside is a whole lot more terrifying. A whole lot more terrifying, but in a good way. See, Jesus's power is for the good, right? Unless you're someone who is going to be the recipient of wrath, as John. Now, really, what you see here is you see the point John made is really making it clear. Because John said, hey, the kingdom of God is coming. He's going to bring judgment. And Jesus is exercising the rule and reign of God. He's bringing even the wind and the waves into obedience. The very world that's in rebellion, he's bringing into obedience to God. Now we see here in 28, it's a very famous scene. And when he came to the other side of the country of the Gadarenes, this is, sometimes you have this, a different word. There's a textual variant here. Sometimes this word looks a little bit different. It's no big deal. It's talking about the same place. 2 demon-possessed men confronted him as they were running out of the tomb. If you look in Mark, it just mentions one of them. So Matthew is clearly picking up and saying, hey, look, there's 2. Mark just zeroed in on one. I'm not sure what Luke does off the top of my head. He just zeroed in on one. Matthew is saying, hey, there were 2. I'm going to talk about both of them, not just one of them. So that's what's happening there. They were so extremely violent that no one could pass by the way. So they're in the tombs. Now, I want you to picture something here for the tombs. Remember a couple of things. One, they crossed over to the area that we would think of as the Decapolis, so they're now in a Gentile area. So they're in an area on the other side of the Sea of Galilee that's a Gentile area, not an area that's primarily occupied by Jews. Next, you see they're demon possessed. So they're controlled by a demon. Next, you see that they're coming out of tombs. So they're living in tombs among the dead. So again, if we were in a Jewish place, we're thinking they're unclean. They're ritually unclean because they're around dead bodies, right? So then they were so extremely violent that no one could pass by. So people are scared of them. They're demon-possessed. They're violent. They're in tombs. Who lives among tombs? No one could even pass by. And they cried out saying, and we actually see in Mark in particular, that they've been chained up. People have chained them up and they burst and broke the chains. That nothing can bind them. Even chains cannot bind them. They're this violent. They're this strong. And they're so violent and so extremely violent that people don't even go by there anymore. They're so terrified of them. Now, I want you to notice something, right? We just saw Jesus stop the wind and the waves. We've seen Jesus cast out demons. We've seen Jesus defeat leprosy. Now, look at the picture of when these demon-possessed men come. Look at how they act. They're so violent that nobody can come near them. And then they cried out saying, what business do you have with us, Son of Man? Have you come here to torment us before the time? Remember, these are the guys that everyone else is afraid of. Everyone else is terrified of these people. And they're terrified of Jesus. Again, who could invoke such fear? No prophet could invoke such fear. Maybe an angel. But even then, you look at the angels, you see in the Old Testament, in Daniel, you see angels and demons, they're going toe to toe. And I wouldn't say they're evenly matched, but it's a real fight to fight. Where, you look at Daniel, it's a picture of, man, we were in a fight for 21 days. The demons kept us from coming for 21 days, and we had to get a whole battle going on. You don't get that picture here at all. They are not even close to evenly matched. His power shown here is so superior to that of the demons that they cry out and they say, what business do you have with us, Son of God? Have you come to torment us? Have you come to torture us? The demons that are actually torturing these two men are themselves worried, oh my goodness, we've just reached a bigger power than us. And he says, torment us before the time. This is just a reference to that final climactic battle when God is going to once and for all, God is going to defeat the forces of evil on this earth and fully claim his kingdom. So now there was a herd of many pigs feeding at a distance from them. And the demons begged him, saying, if you are going to cast us out, send us into the herd of pigs. Now, this is another indication that we're talking about an area of Gentiles, because Israelites or Jews do not have anything to do with pigs. So the picture is, hey, you're about to cast us out of these human beings because you don't want us to be in humans. You don't want humans to be tormented by us. Well, cast us into the pigs. And the demons begged him, saying, if you are going to cast us out, send us into the pigs. And he said to them, go. He does not mince words with them. Go. Like that's what you get. Like, just understand, Jesus is being described here as someone who has immense power, unimaginable, unfathomable power. Go. And they came out and they rushed into the pigs, and behold, the whole herd rushed down the deep bank into the sea, and they drowned in the waters. So even in their attempt to be like, oh, we're gonna go get in the pigs, they didn't even have peace then, because the very act of them going into the pigs ran them into the water. And then the herdsmen ran away and went into the city and reported everything. Remember, these are not Jewish people. These are not Israelites. These are Gentiles. And including what had happened with the demon-possessed men. And behold, the whole city came out to meet Jesus. And when they saw him, they pleaded with him to leave the region. Again, understand, they're scared. They were afraid of these two men. No one even walks near the tombs where these two men are because they're terrified. And Jesus just defeated them both with a word. Understand how terrifying that is. This is power that only God himself can exercise. That's the picture you see in Matthew. He's making that, he's slowly inching you towards that. This is something that only God can do. So they say, hey, look, they're pleading with him, leave the region, like, go. You've cost us, there's like 2,000 pigs, and you just cost us all of this money because of this fight. Like, please leave. So there's a sense of terror and possibly economic concern because they just lost all this money from that. So that's a really good picture here. We're going to finish out some more of this in chapter 9, kind of the same picture. But I'm going to stop this video right now so you can get a little bit of a breather because this is a long one. And then we'll pick up in the next video and look at chapter 9 and just continue to see this same progression going through chapter 9 as we see just how powerful Jesus really is.